to, if you want to follow along, then you'd want to install Docker Desktop. So to install Docker Desktop, just follow the link. Let me paste that in chat a few times. I put apostrophe there. So, you just install it for whatever platform you're on, Windows, Apple, Linux, whatever, right? So you guys can do that while I'm talking about some of the other slides. So the question is, what is DevOps? And if you Google it, the first thing you'll see is DevOps is a combination of cultural philosophies, practices, and tools that increase an organization's ability to deliver applications and services at blah, 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 blah. A lot of stuff there that I don't quite understand. So TLDR, DevOps is automating the development lifecycle. So in general, right, like, you got the dev and then you got the ops, right? So like the ops is kind of like the IT side. Dev is kind of like you as a developer. So what you normally do is that as a developer, you're planning what you want to build. You start coding it, you build it, you do some testing, and now it's time to actually release your app, right? So now to release it, we want to deploy it. Well, we want to release it, we want to deploy it, we want to do some operations and monitoring on this, and we keep rinsing and repeating the cycle, right? It's like sometimes you might hear the term like continuous integration / continuous deployment, right? This is essentially that life cycle. We're continuously creating new features and we're continuously deploying those new features. So here's this hypothetical scenario, right? I'm here, I make a really cool app, right? I want to send it to my friends so they can do it. And then they got to install Python. And that's pretty bad. So that's already one hurdle in their way. They got to install Python to run my app. So, after some back and forth, we make them install Python. So they installed Python, right? They try run the app, and now they got to install dependencies. So this is pretty bad, right? Like to install the app, I need to, or like to send just a simple app to my friend, I need to tell them like, hey, you got to install Python. Okay, so like, hey, you got to install Python, and now like, hey, you got to install dependencies, and the list keeps going on and on, right? Like, what if there's a database, right? Now you got to tell them like, hey, please install this app, install that app, and now just for your friend to run this simple app, now they got to install all these things, and that's pretty awful. So not really that most of a hypothetical situation. I'm pretty sure we all like done this to our friends. Like, hey, try run my app. I made it. It's cool. And this happens. So we're going to use Docker to fix this. So like, first of all, what is Docker? So Docker has like VM-like containers, which will let you reproduce environments across different systems, right? So it has tools to make sure that like the app like operates independently, and it actually has like the ability to communicate between containers. So unlike just running your code inside like a virtual machine, Docker containers can sometimes share libraries, the like bins, the OS as well. So it's a lot more lightweight and faster to run than just a full-blown VM. So that's kind of where my slides end today, because the rest of this is going to be a more practical demo. So we're going to start off with an app, right? So I might post this. You guys can probably just steal the app from this link as well if you want to follow along. But essentially the app is pretty simple. So we have an Express server here. Yeah, so we have an Express server here. We import something called Mongoose. So Mongoose here is just like it helps us connect to our database in a more easy to understand way. If you took the workshop, if you were here for the database workshop yesterday, you guys would have dealt with MongoDB. Mongoose just allows us to like make these kind of models to help to make connecting to the database and creating these entries a lot easier. So all I'm doing is that I'm importing this model I created. I define a few routes down here, and then we want to start it, right? So the first thing I need to do if I were to download these two files, right, like app and models.js, is that now I need to go ahead and install Node.js, right? Because if you're sending this to your friend, they gotta install Node so that they can at least run the app, right? So that's at least one step they need to do. So now the second step is that, like, let's say they were to run this app, right? They would not normally have any dependencies installed, right? So they wouldn't have anything installed. So when they try run the app, they will enter like, hey, you got to install your dependencies, right? So now that's another thing they have to go ahead, and now they got to install all these dependencies, right, by running npm install. And now they can finally start the app. But oh wait, you're going to see that nothing's going to happen here. The reason is that my app requires a Mongo server, right? So now I gotta help my friend set up this Mongo server, either using like MongoDB Atlas like you used yesterday, or a local server, right? So now I gotta go tell them how to install Mongo, right? This is that hypothetical situation we're talking about. This is very real. So the way we're gonna fix this is that we're going to use Docker. So yeah, as you can see, the app just crashed. So Docker is pretty cool because it's got a lot of like pre-made images and stuff. So here's an example, like here's a Mongo image, right? So this Mongo image is on Docker Hub. So Docker Hub has a lot of like pre-made images and stuff, so you can search for like anything that you really want, like Mongo. Actually, there's an explore tab here. Let's explore stuff. So you can see that there's like an Alpine image, which is just essentially like a very lightweight image. Nginx image, there's a Python image, lots of different database images as well. Pretty much anything you'd want, somebody has probably already created an image for it. So what we're going to do is that I want to make this setup process easier, right? So let's say I want to have, essentially, let's say I want to run the Mongo server. So if I weren't using Docker, I'd have to go to the MongoDB website. I'd have to go here. I'd have to like somehow download the thing, and I gotta set it up. If I had Docker installed, it's a very easy process, right? I just run what is an image? Okay, let me actually answer that. So an image essentially stores like the code like inside a container, right? So like an image is like the template for a container. So like a container, I guess you could say, is like a running image. So it like an image is like a set of instructions on how to like set up the environment. So like for example, for Mongo, I can go over to the tags property here. And I can say that, hey, let's say I want to run this Mongo instance here. And as you can see, it tells you exactly all the commands it's trying to run to create this, create the container, right? So it's going to do some stuff. It's going to install some stuff from different repos. It's going to set some stuff up, copy some files over, et cetera, and then it's going to actually start the Mongo server. So what we're going to do is that we're going to use the Mongo image in Docker to essentially create this Mongo server. So over here, there's two ways of doing Docker. So the preferred way I like is using Docker Compose, because Docker Compose essentially just allows you to find stuff in a nice, simple format, and it allows you to run multiple containers at the same time. But all the Docker commands can be run via the command line to spawn a singular container or something. So over here, I have this command that I'm going to run. So first of all, you want to make sure you're running Docker desktop, right? So Docker desktop is here. It has a list of all the containers here. As you can see, I have a few containers here because I've been working on different projects. So let me just delete this one and probably this one as well. So over here is volume. So these are kind of like where your app storage is. So these are, and containers is going to have like all of the running stuff, right? So what we're going to do is that we're going to spawn our first container, which is a Mongo container. So, in terminal, all you want to do is run this awful looking command here. You guys don't really need to follow along with this one. This is just kind of like if you want to run it by a command line. But the idea is that what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a Docker container in detached mode. That way my terminal just kind of like doesn't get hijacked, and I want to run it in the background. I'm just going to call this container Devops Mongo, and now I'm just going to set up like some parameters here. So like the username, the password, the database name, right? And I'm essentially copying that over from my code here. So username, password, database name. That's why I'm calling it that. This port thing is very interesting. So essentially, when you run apps inside Docker, what happens is that everything's encapsulated, right? Not even ports are allowed. So what I'm saying is that on Docker, port 27017, inside the container, I'm going to allow it to escape onto my local host, so 27017. That way, if I connect, so that way I'm essentially running my app on 27017. I can change this first value here, and then essentially it would look like my database is running on a different port. And then this last parameter here is called Mongo, because this is the actual image I want to use, right? I want to use this image, so that's why I'm going to put Mongo at the end. And if I wanted to specify a different version, I could put like a colon and do whatever version I want. But for now, the default Mongo is fine. So I'm going to run this, and you're going to see that this is going to give us a container ID, and nothing's going to happen because I ran it in detached mode. But if I open up Docker desktop here, I can see that now in containers, I see this container pop up with the name I specified. And it's got a whole bunch of logs here. But the idea is now I'm running this MongoDB inside a Docker container. So now if I were to run my app, you'll see that it no longer refuses to connect, and it actually starts up the server, right? And I can do a few requests to that thing, like I can get all the dogs, there's going to be nothing in there, I can add a dog, right? And then I can get that dogs again, and now I can see a list of dogs, right? So that is our app running. So you've effectively reduced some complexity right here. Now if I wanted to send it to my friend, I can just tell him, hey, download node, run the start command, and also run this very scary command in your command line, right, after you install Docker. So that's cool, but we can make this a bit better, right? So right now, I still have to install Node. I still have to install all my packages. Let's containerize the entire app. So what we're going to do is that we're going to define something called a Docker file. So a Docker file is normally we just call the file Docker file, but a Docker file is essentially instructions on how to build the app. So generally Docker files, we start with from. And in this case, I'm going to say from node. Because what I'm going to do is essentially, Docker has a lot of images, like I said. And one of them is Node, so Node.js, right? So what we can do is that we can take everything from this image. So this image already has Node installed inside of it. And we're going to take all of those installed stuff, and we're just going to copy our files into it. So what we're going to do is that we're going to say from Node. So we're going to start off with like an image that already has Node inside of it. If you had a Python app, you could do from Python. If you had some other apps, then you can do like different thing. Like let's say you wanted to run just Ubuntu in general, then you can do from Ubuntu. But in this case, we have a Node app, so let's do from Node. And what we're going to do is that we're going to essentially follow whatever GitHub Copilot is saying here. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a folder in here. So by default, if you know anything about Linux, if you don't specify this work directory, anything I copy is just going to go into the root folder. I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. I think it works without it. But like, just so like if you're viewing the files inside the running container later, you kind of know where to go. So after that, what I'm going to do, I see a question popping up. Let me wait for that one. All right. So, but after what we're going to do is that we're going to install all of the app dependencies. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy over the package.json. So this is the package.json. It generally defines which dependencies you want, like in this case, Express and Mongoose, right? If you're using Python, you might have something called the requirements.txt, which is essentially like the same thing. It defines like which files I should download. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this file over, and then I can run npm install to install all of these app dependencies, right? So as is, my container now has like all the dependencies installed inside of it. And then And then after I install everything, now I can just kind of copy over all of my files. So I copied over just the package file. I can run install. Now I can copy over every file inside here. And then I can do, I can run this command, which is essentially like the command is what I use to start the app. So I can run like node and then app.js. So there is also like a questionable issue here. So what are you copying your files, project files to? So I'm copying it over inside the container. So this Docker file is essentially like its instructions on how to build the container. So I'm starting off with having a container with node built, like node installed into it, creating a new file. Then I'm copying over all of my files from here inside the container. But there is a very slight issue here. Maybe you run into it, maybe you don't. But what I'm doing is I'm copying over this package.json into my container. Then I'm copying over every file, and that file includes my node modules here. So so generally you don't want to like copy over your node modules file because that's for you. Maybe this container is running on Linux or something else, and you don't want like Windows specific things or Mac specific things inside your container. So what we would normally do is create a new file called .docker ignore, and that will just essentially tell Docker like which files and folders you want to ignore. So I'm just going to add node modules there. So it's just going to not copy that over. So now that I defined this Docker file, we can now actually just build our app, right? So if I were to kind of run this, we can see that this thing is creating a Docker file. So it's downloaded node. Here, let's scroll. So downloaded node for us. Oh, it's already gone. Boom. Let's see here. So it downloaded node for us. It created a new folder. It copied over the package.json. It ran npm install, right? It installed all of the dependencies we need. Then it started running our app.json or like app.js. So as you can see, now this thing is actually running. Can I develop an app using Docker images, which would allow me to not have to install the required dependencies? Yes, yes, you can. You can actually just run all your code inside a Docker image. So like, for example, I could just not have Node.js installed and just delete this folder, and I could just continuously just rerun my Docker thing. So right now it's complaining that connection was refused to 27017, but that's fine. The issue is that like it does not know which ports to use yet, so we'll get to that later. So as it is, right, we got these two containers, right? We got one container for our database, Mongo, and one container for our app, right? The issue is that this gets very redundant very fast. Like let's say I wanted to run a different app for our front end and back end, and then like some sort of reverse proxy thing. Maybe I need 2 databases, 3 databases, so on and so forth, right? Let's say this app had a lot of multiple components, right? So running these commands, like I just kind of clicked on the play button here, but if you had to run this command normally, you'd have to like type this all into terminal. You'd have to keep a note of this command, so it gets pretty irritating pretty fast. So what we can do is that we can define something called Docker Compose. So kind of like what I was mentioning with the Mongo image here, is that Docker Compose essentially allows you to define a bunch of different services and containers and how to run it, what ports to forward, all of that stuff just in one file. And if you wanted to run this, then you would just root Docker Compose up and then Docker Compose down, right? So up would start it all, down would take it all down. So what we're going to do is that we're going to define a Docker Compose file, kind of like this, except a little bit different. So this part you can probably follow along. You didn't have to run the other commands, but this one you can follow along if you'd want to. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to do docker compose.yml. And over here, I can essentially define what services and stuff I actually want to create. And also, let me just stop these things by right-clicking here. You can also stop them by on the Docker desktop app. You can just select them, tell it like stop it, delete it, right? I can just delete them now. But what we're going to do is that we're just going to say like version is 3. No idea why we need that, but it's there. So what this is that this is a YML file. So YML, like YAML notation, essentially just has these weird colon things, and you can kind of think about it like nesting stuff, like with tabs, kind of like Python. Kind of like with Python, you know, if you indent it, it adds essentially like another service, right? If I double indent, it's going to be inside of that. So for services, right, what I want to do is that I want to define 2 services, right? One for our app and one for our database. So for our database, right, what we can do is that we can say like the image is Mongo, right? Like Copilot here is helping me out. So the image here is Mongo. So I want to create a new container, like a new service that's based off of this Mongo image, right? And I want to define, and I want to allow this Mongo container to like have its ports exposed, right? So that way, if I go to localhost 27017, I can connect to the Mongo container, right? And another thing we want to do is that we want to tell it like what the username is and what the password is, right? For our database. By default, I don't remember what these are set to, but there is a default value that they're set to. We can overwrite them by doing it this way. And also we can tell it which database to use by telling it the database name here, right? So I'm just going to keep it the same way that I had inside my app.js, where the username was root, the password was root, and the database was called Mongoose. I've lost the file. There we go. So this will essentially spawn our Mongo container for us. And now for app, what we can do is that we can say that, hey, to start our app, you can build it using the directory here, right? So inside this directory, there is a Docker file, right? And to build our app, you can use that Docker file. And then another thing we can tell it is that, hey, expose these ports, right? So the app runs on port 3000. So if I go to localhost 3000, I should be able to connect to this app, right? So this is all cool. So in Docker, I'll show you the command line argument here. So inside Docker, what I can do is I can say that docker compose up -- build. So docker compose up will start your things. The -- build flag here is pretty important. Some of you guys might realize the pain if you forget to put this -- build flag. Essentially, if you change any of your files, you want to rebuild your container, right? So I'm pretty sure there's docker compose build and then docker compose up, but you can do up -- build and it'll automatically like restart everything and build your project. And then at the end, I'm just going to put the -d flag just so that it's like it doesn't hijack my terminal and it just kind of runs in the background. So if I were to run this thing right now, you can see that right now it's building our app. So it ran, copied stuff over, it ran install, it copied the rest of the files over, and now it's complaining that the port's already in use. Yeah, that's fine. I'm probably just running something here. Oh, I'm probably still running the app here. Yeah, cool. So let's try that again. We'll just run the exact same command, docker compose up -build -d, right? So Docker is pretty cool. It's going to actually cache some of this stuff. So it's not going to actually, since I didn't change any files, it's not going to actually deal with the copy step. It's just going to bypass all of that. I don't know why this is panicking on me. There we go. So it already cached the npm install. It has to recopy some stuff, but that's fine. But now it started these 2 containers. In Docker, I can see here, I have my Devops workshop thing, and I have my Mongo container, and I got my app container. So there is one issue here. So currently inside my app.js, I am telling it to connect to localhost. The issue is that since this app is running inside a container, it's going to try connect to that same container and access 27017, which doesn't exist. I'm not running Mongo on the same container. I'm running it in two different containers. So what I want to do is that I need to change this local hosting to something else. And what I can do is I can change that to essentially the name I defined up here. So I call this Mongo. So what I can do is that I can change this to @Mongo. And since Docker does all of this networking thing under the hood, and what it will do is that it will automatically figure out that @Mongo, or like Mongo at port 27017, it should be connecting to this specific container with Mongo inside of it. So now if I were to rerun this Docker file, or sorry, now if I were to rerun Docker Compose, let's go back to terminal. It'll start running it. Cool. It'll start running it, the app and Mongo. So if I go back to Docker thing here, Docker desktop, I can click on the Mongo. So the Mongo is still running. It didn't change, so it's been up for 2 minutes. The app, however, has changed, so it's been up for 20 seconds, and the server has been finally started. And I should be able to still do my queries, right? So I can get all the dogs. There's nothing in there. I can send a request to add a dog. And now if I get all dogs, there should be a dog inside that. So now our app works. There is some other things that you might want to do, right? So as it is that there's two issues, right? So Docker will just kind of run these things in whatever order it sees fit, right? But my app needs the database to be there. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So what I can do is that I can specify like depends on, and I can say Mongo here. So what this is going to do is that it's going to start my Mongo container before it starts my app container, right? That way the database is already up and ready to connect. And then another thing that we can do here is that this one's kind of more experimental. So right now, if I were to like try get a dog by like an ID that doesn't exist, or let's see here. Containers, Mongo. Essentially what we can do is that we can try, what we can do is that we can essentially crash our app by accident. Not sure how to do this yet. Maybe I don't specify an ID here. Yeah, so now essentially the app crashed on us. And if I look to Docker here, we can see that our app crashed on us, which is not pretty good. Like ideally, you want to make your code good enough where it shouldn't crash the app, but a fun thing you can do here is that you can essentially tell your app to just kind of restart always. Oh, not here. Inside the app, you can tell it to just restart always. So what it'll do is that restart always here, there's like a bunch of things here. You can say restart on failure. So if it crashes, it'll restart unless stopped. So essentially, unless you restart your computer or unless you stop the container, it'll just kind of keep restarting. If you do restart always, then every time you turn on Docker, then this app will kind of come back to life, right? And you can do the same for this database here. So now, even if I were to crash the app, it'll kind of re-up itself, you know? It'll kind of come back after being crashed. So now that this is running again with restart always, let's take a look at app here. If I were to try crash this just by sending no ID, it'll crash, but now it's restarted again. So now it's started back up on port 3000 again. So like, even though it crashed, it came back to life. So this part here, so yeah, so this is kind of like how I orchestrated like two containers here, right? So I have my app container, got my Mongo container, and all of this stuff kind of just works in happy land, right? I did not need to install any dependencies, right? Like, so if I didn't have Node installed, I would not need to install Node. If I don't have MongoDB installed, I don't need to install Mongo. There is one like slight issue here, where it's that you might have seen it, but like, essentially all of these files here, run in containers, they tend to be like deletable, right? If you look at Docker, I can see that inside volumes here, there's these like randomly named things here, right? And both of these say that they're in use by the Mongo container for yeah, so both of these are used by the Mongo container, right? And they're just kind of named random things. So this is kind of pretty bad, but like, because what I can do is I can just delete them by accident, right? Not when they're in use, but like if I were to like turn it off, I can easily delete them by accident, right? So generally what you want to do, here that's still turning off. There you go. They're gone now, right? So now if I were to delete them and I were to start my app up again, I'm essentially running with a fresh database. So what you sometimes want to do is that you sometimes want to specify like volumes here and kind of tell it like, hey, instead of storing stuff inside this randomly named volume here, what we're going to do is that we're going to say that anything that you would normally store inside the container at /data/db, we're just going to store it locally in this /data folder, right? So now if you restart this, this sometimes hurts on my computer. Cool. So now if we were to restart this, we see that now there's a data folder here. So as I add stuff to my, now if I add stuff here, so if I were to add a new dog, oh, that's crashing. We wait a little bit. I think this is still connecting. Okay, there it is. So now if we were to add a dog here, and if we were to get all the dogs, you can see that inside the data folder, you can see that this is all of the Mongo stuff here. So even if I were to like restart the app and stuff like that, all of this, or like if I were to delete the volumes, or let's say I just want to stop using Docker in general, I still have all of the data from my database still stored here safely on my hard drive, right? You can specify a different place to put this data. You know, doesn't necessarily have to be in your apps folder, but all of this data is safe for later, for if I want to copy it, send it over, etc., etc. So that's kind of how volumes work. I'm essentially saying that this local folder here will store any data that's normally inside /data/db. So yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about for the workshop. If you have any questions, you know, feel free to ask about it. If you guys want to follow along, I'll probably just start sending this code over in Discord, and that way you can try it out. If you have any issues installing Docker, then please ask. How did I learn about DevOps and Docker? I mean, so if you take a course called CSE 301, which is, I think, Introduction to Software Development, they do talk about Docker. They don't talk about it in too much depth. They kind of just gloss over everything and let you try to figure it out yourself. But after I first heard about Docker there, I got really into it because I'm like, wait, hold on. I can just put everything inside a Docker container, like, and I don't have to install anything ever again. And I'm like, this is the greatest thing possible. You know, some of your friends send you apps and it's like, oh yeah, download Postgres. Oh yeah, download MongoDB, right? So after I learned Docker, it's like I realized that I can just run all this stuff inside a Docker container. You know what? I will mention this since I have time, right? But let me show you what I have for some other apps here. So this is kind of out of scope for what I want to teach, but for is this like Makefile on a larger scale? You don't need to making executable. I mean, I guess so. This is not really the same thing. So like a Makefile, right, which you learn in 209, a make file would essentially tells GCC like how do you compile this C program, right? Uh, you got to compile these things, compile that thing, and then it puts it all together for an executable. You can run a make file inside Docker. That's not the issue. Like Docker is kind of more of a separate thing. Like if I wanted to send like mainly like if I wanted to send this code to my friend, I don't have to tell him to install make. I don't have to tell him to install like the C compiler. I just send them the Docker container, right? They can they can pull down the Docker container and they can start using whatever app I created, right? Or for example, you could make the file, put the file inside a Docker container, inside an environment that you know it'll work on, like Ubuntu. Like this code works on Ubuntu, so I'm going to put it into Ubuntu and I'm going to send it to my friend, right? That way it's a more consistent environment. It'll always work. Can you talk about auto deploy with GitHub Actions? Yeah, I was literally just going to mention that. So for example, um, the way I use this in production is that like I'm working on this thing called IBS, like interview booking system. So for example, what I'm doing is that I have this workflow here on GitHub, right? So every time I push to the main branch, all I'm going to do is I'm going to copy over some environment files and I'm just building and starting the container, right? So because everything's inside Docker, I don't need to tell my script to like, hey, make sure that everything is. I don't have to tell my script like, oh, set up the database, set up the this thing, right? All I have to tell it is just like, build the container, start the container, right? So every time I push the main, that's exactly what it's going to do. It's just going to build and start the container. Uh, this requires some other setup, so this is like a different kind of workshop thing. But like, using Docker, I can make deployment easier. I can say that every time I push to my GitHub repo, I'm just going to restart this Docker container, right? It makes deployment a lot easier because as long as you have Docker set up on the machine you want to deploy to, you just deploy it. No need to tell like them like, oh, can you install this app for me? No need to do that. Can you send a sample workflow file? Sure. This workflow file is not going to make too much sense unless you actually like set up the runner. Actually just copy it from here. I'm pretty sure this is public. Okay, sure. So I can. Okay, you know what? Sure, I can talk a little bit about deployment then, right? So what I have is that I have a server that's free from Oracle, right? So I have a server that's free from Oracle, and what I did is that I have essentially a GitHub Actions runner set up. So I just kind of like, if you search up like GitHub Actions, GitHub Actions, so essentially this tells you like, so it's like actions, right? So on this, you do that, right? So what I have is that I have a self-hosted runner. So I just kind of downloaded it. I set it up here. And what I have is that, yeah, so I have that self-hosted runner set up. So it runs on self-hosted. So every time I push to main, it's actually going to just run on this machine, right? And all it's going to do is it's going to just git clone, build up, right? And that's essentially like what's going to happen here inside this actions runner. So yeah, let me just clear that. So inside this actions runner, if I go to work, you can see that there's this IBS folder here, and I cd into that, and cd into that one. I see, there we go. So I can go into there, and there's like all my files that I have for this specific project all in there, right? And I can do docker ps, and that will tell me all my Docker services I have here. So I have quite a lot of Docker services running, right? for this specific project, I got this like reverse proxy, this backend, this database, a front end, right? For this one, I have another reverse proxy, a backend, a front end. This other one, just the backend. This third one, just the app, and another one, just the app, right? So I have a lot of these apps set up with Docker, and I never had to actually install like a backend server or a database or anything like that. It just kind of works. And also, just to mention, like this server is running on the ARM cores, so it's like a completely different architecture, right? Like my machine runs on x86, right? But this is running on ARM. So like you might hear that a lot of stuff doesn't work on ARM. I can't just copy over an exe that works on Windows over to an ARM machine. But the cool thing about Docker is that since I'm telling it like, hey, here's the container I want, right? Mongo here has a lot of containers here. So it's like, hey, depending on which OS and kind of architecture you're on, it's going to just choose a different container. So since I'm on ARM, it's going to use this one, right? Linux ARM 64, right? And that will essentially run Mongo on ARM, right? Versus if I'm on Windows, it's going to install this one instead, right? The Windows version. So what it will do is that depending on versions, it just kind of works. So it'll automatically choose which version of Mongo to use. I'm just telling it like, hey, I want a Mongo container, and it's going to automatically pick which one I want to install. So that's why it makes deployment even easier, because I don't have to tell it like, hey, install this specific version of Mongo. I can tell it like, hey, I want maybe this Mongo version, but it depending on the platform, it'll choose which kind of exe to run, right? Run the ARM version or run the Windows version. How can you create a self-hosted one? Out of scope. I'll leave that for some other time. Can you paste links and I can read? Yeah, sure. I'll send it to you later. So yeah, just by the way, I'll send you guys the recording later, and I'll probably also... Fun fact, you can run Docker inside Docker? Yes, yes, you can. I did that for one of my projects. It is painful, but I did do it, and it's not very fun. But essentially, my Docker file here, um, it runs like, so I had a kind of app here, right? It says from Docker and Docker. So I have this backend that runs Docker, and this backend, let's see here. This backend here, it spawns a Docker container. Let's see here. Yeah, it runs another Docker container inside of it. So, it really hurts your computer, so I don't recommend doing this. But like, yeah, you can totally run Docker inside Docker. The reason I wanted to do this was that like, I wanted to run a specific container, but I also wanted like isolation. So like for this app, I wanted to run the user's code in a separate container. So, but I wanted everything to just kind of be isolated around a singular Docker container. That way the CI/CD works. I just kind of be like, hey, git clone, Docker compose up, and everything just starts. So yeah, this is probably a bit more advanced, but like essentially I'm running the exact same command, just Docker run. This one's a little bit weird, but like essentially I'm just building it, then I'm running it. Exact same thing. I guess some other cool stuff is that like, by default, right, if I'm running like maybe a React app, right? React has this really cool live reload feature. So when I start up my React app, I can live reload stuff, right? The issue is that if I run that inside a Docker container, what it's going to do is essentially it's going to copy my code from one container into the Docker container, right? So it's going to copy it from my files over to the Docker container. So even if I were to edit files on my local machine, it wouldn't change what's running inside Docker. So that's adds a little bit of pain, right? Like let's say I don't want to install Node. Now I essentially lose out on this like really good functionality where it's like, hey, this stuff automatically changes if I change my code. But if you just use volumes here, you can tell it like, hey, just take everything inside this folder and put it inside, let's say the Node container, right? That's running React. So you can just kind of tell it to automatically like just look at my folder with my files and use those to start up the app. That way you can essentially run all of like you can have React inside a Docker container with all of its dependencies, and it'll just be looking at your code files and automatically restarting. If you guys have any other questions, comments, type it in chat. How does one get into this? Any good resources? To be fair, I don't know. I just kind of started using Docker because I'm like, you know what? I heard that I can do stuff with this, and I just tried it out, right? Like I said, if you do CSA 301, they actually have you doing like Docker, and they tell you to do Docker with like 2 billion different apps. Like they run like three different databases inside Docker, three different services inside Docker, another like I think another one. So yeah, there was like 7 containers running inside Docker for that CSC 301 project. What YouTube videos you watched, or where do you usually read about this? Example, Free Code Camp. Documentation is really good actually. Um, like for example, like let's say I wanted to run, like I know that I can run Mongo on Docker, right? So what I did is I went to overview, I read all this stuff, I saw this thing here, and I just tried it out, you know? Like the documentation generally is pretty good. It actually tells you like all of the different things you can configure here, all the different environment variables. So like docs tend to be pretty good. Yeah, exactly. The best way to learn is to containerize your own project. Like I think in the next workshop you'll be doing Python bot maybe. I don't quite remember. There's a web scraping workshop. There's a Discord bot workshop on Thursday, right? C basics on Friday. So for example, like if you want to learn Docker, right? Like just start containerizing an app that you wanted to do, right? Like that's how I first got into it. I had a Discord bot and I Dockerized it, right? Or I have my app that I was making for a project course and I just Dockerized it, right? Um, so just Dockerizing stuff that you already have just to make it easier to deploy or just easier to send to your friends is actually not a bad idea. Like you'll learn more based off of necessity rather than just like learning it for the sake of learning it, right? Copy pasting is every programmer's best friend. Sure. I I always make sure I know what I'm copy pasting. Would recommend you check what you're copy pasting as well. You never want to copy paste like rm-rf and be very sad. Yeah, but just like for example, like let's say you were to copy paste this thing here, right? You can copy paste this thing here, but the best thing to do is like, well, before I run this, let me actually see on the Docker documentation what happens here. I can go to Docker Compose. I got this entire documentation here that tells me exactly how I run the commands. There's a lot of tutorials on the Docker docs anyways. So Docker Compose, they tell you about config files. They do a lot of explanation here. Yeah, there's just a lot here. Docker file reference, compose file reference. I saw that there as well. Specifications on compose files, so you can see exactly what all of these things mean because they explain it to you. So yeah, they tell you like, hey, what is this thing doing? What is that thing doing? What are all these things doing here? Docker allows you to tell it like, hey, only use this much percent of my CPU, stuff like that. Other configs, specifying like depends on, right? We said this one, so it does start up and shut down dependencies between services. Deploy, there's environment files, there's a lot of stuff here on the docs, and if you just like before you copy paste blindly, just like Google, like, hey, Docker, what is image, what is restart, what is environment, what is ports, right? And the Docker docs here will tell you pretty much everything you want to know. Like for example, like let's say I wanted to do ports, I can just search ports on the site, and I can see that, hey, here's ports, exposes container ports, right? Tells you exactly how to use it, all the different options that you can use. But yeah, let me know if you guys need any help installing Docker as well. Uh, you know, you just install it from here. I was going to make a tutorial video on this, but it turns out trying to install Docker inside a VM to make a tutorial on it is very painful. So, uh, sorry about that. Because you're trying to essentially run VMs inside VMs, and it goes down all the way. Yep, so just a reminder, I'll actually make some detailed steps. Like, I already started making some steps here, but like I'm gonna actually write something more detailed than this and send it to you guys alongside the recording and some starter files, so that you can try Dockerize it yourself. If you need help, then you can refer back to the guide and like how we ended up Dockerizing. Where will we post it? Probably in a day or two when I actually get time to make it. I'll probably post it here somewhere on the server, be like at workshop or something. I'll let GDSE figure it out. Yep, Docker's pretty big of a game changer. Instead of having to just download stuff, you just run it in a container. Daksh best TA. That reminds me, I need to do a lot of work for my TA ships. I got a Slack message about it that I've been ignoring for a while. It wasn't Arnold, but yeah, sure.